Eddie Van Halen let an insurance adjuster spend 30 minutes undervaluing everything in his home studio before saying a single word. What he said, and then played, left the adjuster sitting in his car in the driveway for a long time afterward. It was a Tuesday morning in March 1983, and the 5150 Studios at Eddie Van Halen's property in Studio City was not yet officially named 5150. That would come later, when the space had been fully built out and the album recorded inside it had given the studio its permanent identity. In March of 1983, it was still in the process of becoming what it would be. A converted structure behind the main house, mid-renovation, with the acoustic treatment partially installed and the recording equipment arriving in stages as Eddie sourced and modified and in many cases built the pieces he needed. It smelled of sawdust and solder and the particular chemical warmth of new electronic components and fresh lumber and the residue of work done late at night by someone who did not keep conventional hours. The floor had cable runs taped down in provisional configurations that would be made permanent once the walls were finished. The lighting was temporary. The space had the atmosphere of a serious project in the middle of being realized rather than a finished thing that could be shown off, and Eddie had made no apologies for this when he'd met Robert Falk at the front door and shown him through. Eddie had purchased a homeowner's insurance rider to cover the studio equipment, and the insurance company had sent an adjuster to assess and document the contents before finalizing the policy. The adjuster's name was Robert Falk. He was 41 years old, had been working property assessment for 17 years, and approached his work with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has learned that the details are where the problems live. He arrived at 9 in the morning with a clipboard, a camera, and a printed valuation guide for professional audio equipment that had been published the previous year. Eddie met him at the door, showed him through to the studio, and said he was welcome to take his time. Then he sat down in a chair in the corner of the room with a cup of coffee and watched. Robert Falk moved through the space with his clipboard and his camera in the practice sequence of someone who has done this hundreds of times and has reduced the process to a reliable sequence of steps. He photographed the mixing board first, a customized console that Eddie had been building out over the previous 18 months with the help of a technician friend, adding modules and rerouting signal paths to accommodate the specific way he wanted to work. He photographed the tape machines, the rack-mounted outboard equipment along the back wall, the patch bay with its grid of interconnected cables. He noted serial numbers and cross-referenced them against his valuation guide with the efficiency of someone who is moving through a checklist rather than looking at a room. He was precise and systematic and covered the space in a way that left nothing undocumented, which was exactly his job and exactly what he did. Then he got to the guitars. There were 11 of them in the studio that morning, some on stands, 2 hanging on wall-mounted hooks, 1 disassembled on the workbench in various stages of a modification Eddie had been working on for the previous 2 weeks. They were, collectively, among the most significant instruments in contemporary rock music. They included 2 versions of the Frankenstrat, the black and white striped instrument that had become as visually recognizable as any guitar ever made, the one that had been on the cover of magazines and in the hands of the person who had used it to play Eruption, which was 4 minutes long, and had permanently changed what musicians around the world understood the electric guitar to be capable of, as well as several other custom-built instruments that Eddie had constructed himself from components sourced from guitar shops and lumberyards and electronic suppliers across California. Each one had been modified with pickups rewound to Eddie's own specifications, hardware adapted from other instruments or fabricated from scratch, and bodies shaped and finished to suit the particular sound and feel he was looking for at the time he built it. Each one was unique. Each one existed nowhere else in the world. None of them had manufacturer documentation. None of them had receipts from a guitar company. None of them had serial numbers registered with any manufacturer, because none of them had been made by a manufacturer. They had been made by Eddie Van Halen in the specific way that things are made when the person making them is pursuing a sound that does not yet exist rather than replicating a sound that someone else has already achieved. Robert Falk looked at them with his valuation guide open. "These," he said, making a note, "are custom-built instruments. No manufacturer documentation, no provenance records, no established market comparables. He photographed each one methodically. For insurance purposes, custom instruments without documentation are assessed at parts value. Depending on the components, I'm looking at somewhere between $200 and $500 each. Eddie said nothing. Robert moved to the workbench and examined the disassembled guitar with the focused attention of someone who is looking at an object rather than an instrument. He noted the body blank, the neck, the pickup components laid out in order of assembly. "This one I can't assess as a complete instrument since it's not currently functional," he said. "Parts value only." Eddie nodded and sipped his coffee. Robert Falk spent another 12 minutes completing his documentation. He noted the amplifiers, the modified Marshall stacks that Eddie had spent years adjusting and rewiring to produce the specific sound that had become known in the industry simply as the Brown sound, and assessed them at standard amplifier values, which is to say, the value of a Marshall amplifier, without accounting for the fact that these were not standard Marshall amplifiers in any functional sense. They were instruments that had been rebuilt from the inside by someone who understood electronics at a level that most studio engineers did not, to produce a sound that no unmodified amplifier had ever produced. Robert's valuation guide listed the Marshall brand, the model number, and a current market value. Robert wrote down the number. It was accurate for the object described in the guide. It was not accurate for the object in the room. Robert added his figures. He reviewed them. He looked at the total with the satisfied precision of a man who has completed a thorough job and arrived at a defensible number. He looked around the room one final time. The board, the machines, the guitars on their stands, the disassembled instrument on the workbench, with the assessing gaze of someone who has now seen everything and has nothing left to document. "I can give you coverage on the audio equipment at standard rates," he said. "The guitars I'm going to have to assess at parts value given the documentation situation. Total insurable value for the room is going to come in around—" He did the final calculation. Approximately $42,000. He looked up from his clipboard. Eddie Van Halen set down his coffee cup. He had not spoken in 30 minutes. He looked at Robert Falk with the expression of a man who has been listening carefully to an assessment of something he knows completely and has waited, without impatience, for the assessment to finish before responding. "Can I show you something?" Eddie said. Robert gestured with his pen. "Be my guest." Eddie stood up, picked up one of the guitars from its stand, the black and white striped instrument, the one that Robert had assessed at somewhere between $200 and $500, plugged it into one of the modified Marshall stacks, adjusted two knobs on the amplifier with the automatic precision of someone who has made those adjustments 10,000 times, and sat on the edge of the workbench. He played for 4 minutes. Not a song, not a recognizable track from a Van Halen album, not something with a title that Robert Falk would or wouldn't know. Something that had no name because it had never been played before, assembled in real time from the vocabulary of a man who had been building that vocabulary since he was 7 years old, sitting at a piano in the Netherlands listening to his father play. It began quietly, the guitar's tone at low volume, before Eddie brought the amplifier up to the level where its specific character became audible. The Brown sound, musicians called it, that particular warmth and compression that no other amplifier in the world produced, and that had required years of modification to achieve. Then it opened up. It moved through registers that Robert had not heard a guitar move through. It used the instrument's sustain in a way that seemed to extend the physical decay of the note beyond what the physics of the situation should have permitted. The modified pickups, contributing a magnetic field that held the string's vibration longer and fuller than any stock component could manage. It contained, in the middle section, a passage of two-handed tapping at a speed and with a melodic coherence that made the technique feel not like a trick, but like the natural grammar of the music, the way a vowel is not a decoration on a consonant, but an equal part of the language. The room, with its partial acoustic treatment and its sawdust smell and its cables running across the floor, held the sound in the imperfect way of a space that is still being built for this purpose, and somehow that imperfection made what was coming through the amplifier more rather than less present. Like hearing a voice in an ordinary room rather than a performance space, where the proximity of the source makes the sound land differently. Robert Falk stood in the middle of the room with his clipboard at his side and listened. When it stopped, the silence in the partially finished studio had a specific quality. The quality of a room that has just contained something larger than its dimensions suggested it could hold, the air still carrying the ghost of a sound that had occupied it completely and was now absent. "How long have you been playing?" Robert asked. The question came out differently than his questions usually came out, without the clipboard rising, without the pen positioning itself above the form. There was no field to fill in for this. It was not a professional question. It was the question of a person who has just heard something and needs to understand it better. "Since I was 7, Eddie said. My father taught me piano. Guitar came after." "And these guitars," Robert said. He looked at the instrument in Eddie's hands with the expression of someone revising an assessment in real time, the way a calculation changes when a new variable is introduced that the original equation didn't account for. "You built them?" "Most of them," Eddie said. "The parts are worth $200. The guitars are worth considerably more than that." Robert Falk looked at his clipboard. He looked at the total he had written at the bottom of his assessment form. He looked at the guitar. "I'm going to need to request a specialist valuation," Robert said, "for the instruments. There's a process for custom pieces with demonstrated artistic significance." He paused. "I should have asked about the instruments before I started the assessment." "It's fine," Eddie said. He set the guitar back on its stand with the care of someone returning something to its proper place. Robert gathered his clipboard and his camera and his valuation guide, which had proven useful for approximately half of what was in the room and entirely useless for the other half. He thanked Eddie for his time, walked back through the house and out to his car in the driveway. He sat there for 11 minutes. He was not, by profession or temperament, a person who spent time sitting in driveways. His days were structured around movement between locations and the completion of forms that had clear fields for clear data. He had 11 more appointments that week. He had a lunch at 12:30. He had no time scheduled for sitting in driveways in Studio City thinking about what had just happened in a half-built recording studio behind a house on a Tuesday morning. What he was doing for those 11 minutes was something his professional life had not previously required of him, which was finding the right category for an experience that didn't fit any of the categories he had been given. He had spent 17 years assessing the value of things. He had learned, in those 17 years, a great deal about the relationship between price and value. The two were related, but not identical, and the gap between them was where most of the interesting problems in his industry lived. He had assessed art, jewelry, antiques, specialized equipment of dozens of categories. He understood provenance. He understood rarity. He understood the premium that uniqueness commands in a market. What he had not previously encountered was an object whose value was inseparable from the specific human being who had made it, and whose worth could not be accessed by looking at the object on a stand in a quiet room, only by hearing what happened when that human being picked it up. The valuation guide in his hand had no column for that. His 17 years of professional experience had no protocol for it. He had undervalued 11 guitars by a margin he was not yet able to calculate, because the calculation required a unit of measurement his guide did not contain. The specialist valuation came back 6 weeks later. The instruments were assessed collectively at significantly more than Robert Falk's initial estimate, a figure that his original $42,000 total for the entire room had not approached. He reviewed the report, updated the policy, and signed off on the coverage adjustment without remark. He kept a copy of the specialist report in his files for the rest of his career. Not as a reference document, he never had another case that required it. As a reminder of the Tuesday morning he had spent 30 minutes in a room with 11 irreplaceable instruments and the person who had made them, and had seen the parts rather than the whole, right up until the moment the amplifier came on, and the parts became something that no valuation guide had a line for. After that, he asked more questions before he started writing, not because his methodology required it, because he had sat in a driveway for 11 minutes and understood that the most important things in a room are sometimes the ones that don't appear on any list until someone turns them on.